Okay, well, thanks to Vila and to Rick for a very interesting presentation. We have a number of questions come up already, and I'm assuming as we'll get in discussion, others may well arrive. I think, first of all, let's think about DOIs. There's been a couple of questions around DOIs. I think you picked up on some of them already, Rick, when you were talking. But I'd maybe ask Vila, especially when you're dealing with data sets of restricted access. Kate's asked, even if a data set is restricted, can you actually get a DOI for that? And I think you said yes, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. The DOI has nothing to do with the access conditions set on a data set. Every data set that is published gets a DOI. Yeah.
I think maybe, Rick, you might want to just go the next step in terms of when you talked about publishing data sets as well through data papers. Now there is an issue there in the sense that you can only publish a data set. By definition, if you publish it, the data set is going to be in the public domain. I think that's right, isn't it, Rick?
Yes, that's right. I mean, this is again another reason why it's useful to have a discussion around each case, because we do have situations where the researchers themselves would like maybe an 18-month embargo, and that fits within, say, NERC's data policy to support an embargo of up to 2 years from when the data were finished being collected. But the journal may require that data to be available, actually accessible, within a year. So obviously the researcher would have to come back to us and say, actually, no, can you lift that embargo early? That's fine, as long as we got something from the researcher, to say that's what they want, that's okay. We have had a few occasions where the journal are okay with the data being embargoed from public access, but do want some anonymous reviewees to peer review the data set. So we've had to arrange some sort of special anonymous access. So we can do that. It's a bit labour intensive, but there's ways around it. So in terms of the DOIs, that, as Vila was saying, it's not really there's no relevance to whether the data is absolutely accessible or whether it's planned to be accessible. The journals, some of them, again, the best thing to do, probably the best advantage is to, whatever journal you're thinking about, is to find out exactly what their policy is. Some of them just say, as long as you've deposited the data with a data centre, if you've got a DOI, that's even better. But as long as you've got some evidence that it's in there, we're happy. Others may say, and I don't know this for sure, that the data must actually be publicly available when the journal paper is published. But as I say, the important thing is to find out from the journal you're thinking about well in advance, and then you can be prepared for what they require.
Okay. Ooh, right. I've lost the question. Okay, where are we? Okay, I think Robert Nichols asking a question around, basically I interpret that to mean if the data have already been deposited somewhere else and is available through a journal of scientific data, do we have to then go ahead and deposit those data with one of the data centres? Yeah, do you want to answer that?
Okay. Yeah, I think there's probably a number of aspects to this. Now, going back to the early slides about what data we're talking about with long-term value, we're talking about the raw data, the base data. Now, sometimes when people say they've given the data that underpins their paper to be published as supporting information for their journal paper, they sometimes mean more summarised results as a data set in itself. But we're talking about the raw data. So that's the first sort of thing to clarify. But even then, even if you have, maybe got quite a small set of raw data that's been put in as supporting documentation or supporting information for a journal paper, we would say yes, absolutely, it needs to be deposited with one of the data centres. Partially because, in the first place, that doesn't quite meet, certainly wouldn't meet NERC's data policy, because the data are not. They're not discoverable to international standards. There's no catalogue record. They're not actually easily discoverable because it's based on whether you can access that journal and how they make those publications discoverable rather than the data sets. But more importantly, we issue DOIs for the data set, which gives you credit as an output for the data set. Now, we also, you know, with the license and the conditions that are accessing the data set, you know, people are required to cite you as an author, whereas if they can get the data from maybe from supporting information in a journal paper, then there's no credit given to you for that data set. It's just part of that journal paper. So there's a, you know, you're losing out in effect around the credit for the data set as an output in its own right. So yes, you definitely need to be depositing with the data center as well.
Okay, thanks, Rick. Again, a question from Attila around are we interested in model data in terms of our definition of data of long-term value? I would say yes.
Yeah, again, this is another sort of those areas where a one straight approach doesn't work. We do hold some model data outputs and scenario model maps. There's an awful lot of model data that people would consider not useful to keep in the long term. And again, that's a discussion that we want to have with you about what you think as the generator of those model outputs, of whether you think they are of long-term value in their own right. It's sometimes the case that it would cost so much time and effort to reproduce them that actually, even though you can reproduce them, it's much more cost-effective to just store them. Thing with modelled output data, though, is of course, well, is it any use in the future if the models have changed or whatever? But certainly, if it underpins research as an audit trail back to that data set, or if it's of long-term value because it's too difficult to reproduce, then certainly yes, we would. But again, the starting point is to have a discussion over, do we think this is worth bringing into the data center, and that's really the best way to deal with all of those situations.
So that also opens a can of worms around the management of models and software as well, which has been developed for the research. Vela, did you want to comment anything around that question?
Oh, I think that's covered everything. I'm happy to take the next question, which is on the consent forms. Shall I? Okay, which is a brief one. We want to see we want the general consent form, so we need to know what the wording is that was used. It's uploaded as documentation, so it's also available to the reusers. It helps us also make sure that there's no breach of that consent agreement when we publish the data. We do not need the signed consent forms. It's up to the researchers to state to us whether all the participants have indeed signed that consent form. We don't need to see that form. Yeah.
Okay.
Shall I also take? I see there's another UKDS related question from Mark Hirons, and I think it's probably been addressed in the presentation, that it asks about linkages between social ecological data. Can the documentation be edited at a later stage to point to relevant ecological data? The answer is yes. Even if a data set that we've received has been published in our catalogue, if further related resources need to be added later on, then we will add those to the catalogue records. It might be different for EIDC, but that's our point of view. So the metadata records can be edited.
Yeah, that's exactly the same with the IGC. That really also explains the reason why the actual data set is held in one secure store and the supporting documentation are held separately and accessed separately, because obviously we don't want to be changing anything to do with the actual data set. But in the future, people may want to upgrade the supporting documentation with other links, with other information, with improved supporting documentation, etc. So it allows that to happen without compromising the data set itself or the DOI, which points at that data set that hasn't changed. One of the only other things though I was going to highlight is that we are very aware though that there are occasions where we link in socioeconomic data with terrestrial data where we need to be a little bit careful, or maybe consider that it doesn't compromise any of the sensitivity issues around being able to identify people, because obviously if we're linking, say, maps of boreholes with locations around farms with some socioeconomic data which has been anonymised. If you put the two together, it potentially could be a bit of a problem, or could highlight where those locations are. But again, that's a discussion we would always make sure we had, or we have with you, if people are suggesting we link individual data sets. But again, you'll probably be the best people to tell us where you thought there was an issue or not.
I think it's fair to say you do work quite closely together in this area, don't you? And you have a track record on working on other projects and programs, for example, the RELU program, Rural Economy and Land Use, where you've been working together for a few years now. So I think the message there is you do talk to each other in the background about what's going on, what you're managing. So there is a good joint-up approach, even though if I'm sitting between the two of you at the moment, so to speak. I am going to come back to the question from the ESPA Directorate, but we'll carry on for the moment. There's a question about the size limitations on data. Some data sets can be large. I think in environmental sciences, size isn't too much of a problem, because certainly we're used to managing, in some areas, data of sets of petabyte size. But Verna, do you want to comment on any issues around size in social economic data sets?
We try not to make size a problem either. the limitation, there is certain limitations in that where the data are deposited into the reshare repository by the researchers themselves, then that the uploads limit on individual files or zip folders is, I think, 2 GB at a time, and that is really to do with the speed of a person's internet connection in accessing that online repository. Where data files are larger, then we get them transferred to us, and we will handle them here in-house. So yes, we try to. There's not many data sets where we cannot handle them.
Rick, did you want to add anything to that? I think similarly, we tried not to make it a problem. We have sort of limits, obviously, and there are some technical aspects, some technical issues around how we actually handle the data when they're large. We would also try and, if things are really difficult, we would also try and seek a practical solution, a compromise, and we've done that, in the past for, say, some satellite information where we don't take the raw data. We would take a sort of summarized version. Alternatively, we would actually consider whether we are actually the best or the most appropriate repository. So Earth observation data, for example, we may actually push towards one of the other data centers who are more geared up for that very, very specific kind of data. We can pretty much take anything because we're not really a specialist repository as such, but if we need to, we can push things towards our other partner environmental data centers.
Okay, and I think that actually quite neatly moves on into the next question from Emily about data, that's what you might call secondary data sets, those generated from synthesizing evidence or bringing together other existing data sets. And I guess it goes back to how you define a data set of long-term value. And I guess thinking here there may be issues around intellectual property rights when you're using data sets provided by third parties. Rick, do you want to touch on that first and maybe to follow up?
Yes, this is a very good question. It's a difficult area, and we have a team of licensed terms and conditions sort of experts who we call upon to give us their expert opinion about what we can do. We will basically work with you to determine what is the situation and then ask them for guidance, because at the end of the day we'd be the organisation that are making something public, and therefore we need to ensure that it's okay to make those data public. Now, where there's a third party interest, where the data are derived from other people's data, there are always intellectual property right issues, and it often comes back to what were the terms and conditions of the researcher gaining access to those data in the first place, and what they can do with them. Now, in many cases where you're looking at evidence reviews from existing data and literature, it can be from a vast number of sources, and therefore it becomes almost impossible to guarantee that every one of those gave their permission for explicitly for you to make derived data accessible. So, you know, it comes down to, well, what's the likelihood that that's going to be a problem? And in the past, we've got data sets that are available because that community generally work towards doing that, and we don't think there's a problem. We have other data sets where we have to have a different access level to them rather than the straightforward freely accessible. People have to say which part of the data set they want to use because there's underlying ordnance survey data, and we have to check with them that it's okay to give that data out because it's got an IPR issue around it. So I think, you know, at the end of the day, we would always look at each case. There's no sort of straight answer to that. Of course, one of the other aspects that Mark was saying was that you know, if those data are already accessible publicly, and maybe we're talking about sort of where there's only one or two other data sets involved, it's possible that you don't really even need to deposit the data sets. You certainly wouldn't need to deposit the data sets again, but if you've derived data from it, as long as there's no way back to those existing data sets, then there's not a problem. The IPR would be usually around the use of data sets where it includes parts of other data sets. So I think it's, you know, again, it comes down to the exact detail of what you're doing and what you want to do, and we would always ask our experts for advice in that.
Vela, did you want to add anything to that answer? That probably sounds like a no, as Vela's got a microphone muted.
Sorry, very similar approach, yes. We would take them, but we obviously need to look at IP, etc. Yeah. Okay,
I think that actually quite, to some extent, that quite neatly segues into the question from Esper Secretariat about what about data management international partners. I think a good way there is to think about what NERC's policy is more generally, that we don't necessarily have to hold all the data generated through NERC funding if the data are held by another recognised repository we trust that has the same level of standards as NERC has. We're quite happy for those data to be held there, but I think the key thing is we want to know about those data and at least have a metadata record at points for them being held elsewhere. Again, Vela, do you want to comment on that first and then maybe Rick to follow up?
Our approach for data created by international partners would be to discuss with the researchers what would be the best approach. Important to remember is that we make the research data available worldwide, so there's no restriction to who can use them. Anyone in the world who needs those data for research purposes can come and access them. If it's better to house those data in the country of origin, then that can be done. If it's better to host them in the UK, then that can be achieved as well. Usually it's a fairly easy discussion within a project to find the optimal solution.
And Rick?
Exactly the same. We have a data set where part of the requirements for where it was generated in the Amazon rainforest on a platform there. Part of the requirements were that those data sets were deposited into a repository locally that the Brazilian government were funding. That was okay. You know, we can work within those parameters, make sure there's a link between the two, and make sure everyone's aware that you know there is a copy there. We have a catalogue record that does that and points to those data sets. And as Mark was saying, as long as it meets the requirements of NERC that those data are discoverable and are accessible under the freely accessible terms in terms of the terrestrial side, then yes, it's completely fine. But as I say, the main thing is we know about them and we can make sure things are in place to point people towards them as an output from the NERC-funded research.
Okay, so I think we now go back to the last question on the list, which was about do we really know if policymakers and practitioners tend to access data from the data centres? I think certainly in terms of policymakers, the evidence we have is that policymakers want evidence. They may not necessarily want the data. They may not want to actually derive that evidence themselves from the data. So quite often the data tend to be used by intermediaries, consultants or other academics or other researchers to generate evidence which is then supplied to policymakers. I mean, I do know of colleagues in government who will go and actually look at the data set, but more often than not, I say that they're after something which outlines and summarises the evidence for them. I mean, do you have any examples, say, Vela, from ESDS for that question? Vela, your microphone's muted.
Sorry. We compile a lot of use cases on how our data are used, and what we're finding is obviously data are being reused for new research, they're being reused for teaching, for methods development, for development of policy recommendations, etc. At times it's difficult to really track how the data are used, so we started actively compiling qualitative use cases which are also searchable in our discovery platform and available on our website to show how data have been reused for new purposes.
And Rick,
final comments? Similarly, we look at the download statistics which give an indication of interest in those data sets. It obviously doesn't tell you what people have been doing with them, but it does give you an indication of the interest, and we look at those. And we just look at those in terms of where those email accounts are from, whether they're academic or government, etc. Obviously, it's a fairly crude metric because obviously some people may be accessing use for academic via their own Google email accounts, things like that. But it gives us an indication, and certainly, yeah, we do have a large number of government and academic users, and we're working on certainly things like citation metrics, where those data sets have been cited by the DOIs, getting that feedback and providing that to the originators of the data to give you feedback on how useful your data has been in terms of impact, where it's been cited, what it's been used for as well. So we play a sort of difficult balancing act between not putting too many barriers in the way, certainly the sort of a whole open data approach where the fewer barriers to accessing the data the better, and obviously if we put in front of people a big long list of questions about what they're going to do with it, they may put people off as well. So we try and play a balancing act, and as I say, providing the feedback on the citation metrics is one good way of doing that, because it shows you how your data sets have been cited in terms of their reuse or use.
Great, well thanks for that. I was about to thank our speakers and I realised one of our speakers has now already left. Thank you to Vela and thank you to Rick for giving a very useful, informative talks. And thank you to everyone who's made the time to attend the webinar this afternoon, and to the ESPA Directorate, especially David, for helping doing the organising and technical support. And as we've said, the webinar has been recorded, so the recording and the slides will be made available in due course. So thank you everyone, and good afternoon.